What if the peace deal that just saved the world from war was already broken before the ink dried?
Right now, somewhere deep in the Iranian mountains, workers are pouring concrete over craters that American and Israeli bombs created just weeks ago, and nobody's supposed to notice. But if you're watching this, then you already have.
So if you care about what's actually happening in one of the most dangerous regions on Earth, hit that like button, subscribe for deep analysis like this, and share this with someone who needs to understand the truth before the news cycle moves on to something else.
Let me take you back to June. The world finally exhaled. After months of escalating military strikes and the constant threat of a catastrophic regional war, Washington and Tehran announced they had reached an agreement, a memorandum of understanding. 60 days to negotiate.
Iran freezes its nuclear program. The United States holds back on new sanctions.
Both sides stepped back from the edge. For a moment, the Middle East didn't feel like a powder keg waiting for a spark. But here's what happened while diplomats were celebrating in air-conditioned rooms thousands of miles away. Commercial satellites orbiting above Iran were capturing something the regime didn't want anyone to see. And by early July, when those images finally became public, everything changed. Because the ceasefire that was supposed to be holding, it never actually existed.
The story begins at a place called Talagan 2.
It sits inside Parchin, one of the most secretive military compounds in all of Iran, hidden in the mountains southeast of Tehran. This isn't a power plant. This isn't a reactor for making medicine or electricity. According to Israeli intelligence, this is Project Ahmad, Iran's secret nuclear weapons testing facility from the early 2000s, and it was hit hard twice.
Once in October of last year, and again in April of this year, when Israeli and American warplanes tore through Iran's nuclear infrastructure in a campaign designed to set their ambitions back by years.
By early June, satellite imagery showed exactly what you'd expect. Massive craters in the earth, twisted metal, buildings that looked finished, like the program had been crippled. But then something unexpected happened. Within 12 days, those same craters weren't abandoned. They were covered, not with dirt or rubble, but with active construction materials.
Mesh netting was laid across the damage. Concrete mixer trucks started appearing in satellite photos, their engines running, waiting to pour.
This is the detail that matters most. Nobody pours concrete into a hole they're trying to empty. You pour concrete into holes you're trying to seal back up. You pour concrete to rebuild what was destroyed. And a facility tied to nuclear weapons testing doesn't get rebuilt by accident. It gets rebuilt because a government has decided that the risk of getting caught is worth it. But Talagan 2 is only half the story. There's a second location that should alarm you far more. Locals and analysts call it Pickax Mountain. It's a massive underground complex carved directly into the Zagros range, built specifically to survive the kind of bombing campaign that just tore through Parchin. And here's the crucial part. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's nuclear watchdog, has never been allowed inside. Not once, not for inspection, not for monitoring, not for anything.
This means there's a completely unmonitored facility hidden inside a mountain with zero international oversight.
No cameras, no inspectors, no witnesses to what's being built, stored, or tested there. And satellite images from late June show something disturbing. Vehicle traffic surging along the roads leading to its entrances, construction activity ramping up, reinforcement work continuing. All of this under the exact terms of the agreement Iran had just signed, which specifically covered every nuclear-related facility in the country, including Pickax Mountain. Think about the implications for a second. Iran signed an agreement saying it would freeze its nuclear program. Within weeks, satellite images showed it was doing the exact opposite. This wasn't a secret the regime was going to keep for long. Because in 2024, keeping nuclear construction secrets is almost impossible. Satellites circle the planet every 90 minutes. They capture high-resolution imagery of nearly every square meter of Earth's surface. You can't hide concrete trucks. You can't hide craters being filled. You can't hide a pattern that obvious. And this is where we need to understand the timeline, because timing changes everything. In late February, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated air campaign against Iran's nuclear infrastructure. It was the most direct assault on Iran's nuclear program in the entire history of the Islamic Republic. Multiple sites hit simultaneously, multiple precision strikes, multiple messages sent that the West would not tolerate continued nuclear weapons development. For weeks, everyone braced for all-out war. Regional allies moved military assets.
Insurance premiums spiked for ships in the Persian Gulf. Energy markets priced in the threat.
But then, on June 11th, something unexpected happened. A ceasefire framework emerged. Washington and Tehran found a way to step back. And for exactly 4 weeks, there was a holding pattern. No new strikes, no public escalations, just fragile, nervous peace. And during those 4 weeks, while diplomats were working on the language of the agreement, someone in Iran made a calculation. They decided that rebuilding was worth the risk.
That pouring concrete over bomb craters was more important than honoring the deal they were about to sign.
That's not the action of a government that's genuinely interested in peace. It's the action of a government that's already thinking about the moment when the ceasefire collapses. Now, let me be fair, because there are alternative explanations that deserve consideration. Some analysts have suggested that some of this activity might not be new construction at all. It might be an attempt to recover equipment or materials that got trapped underground during the bombing campaign.
That's a reasonable possibility.
Except for one detail that undermines it completely. You don't pour fresh concrete over a hole you're trying to dig into. You pour concrete after you're done, after whatever you needed to retrieve has been retrieved, after the work is finished. The construction pattern at Talagan 2 doesn't look like salvage. It looks like sealing. It looks like a regime putting the lid back on the box before anyone notices it was ever open. Now consider the human side of this story because it matters. Somewhere near Parchin, ordinary Iranian construction workers are being bussed into heavily restricted military zones. Men pouring concrete for a project they were probably never told the true purpose of. Men going home each night to families in a country whose economy has been strangled by sanctions, unaware that their labor might be helping rebuild facilities tied to nuclear weapons research from 20 years ago. They're not making these decisions. They're absorbing the consequences, just like they always do, and that's the quiet tragedy underneath every satellite photo. A government willing to spend its people's labor, its people's risk, and its people's future chasing a program most of its own citizens will never benefit from. A regime so convinced it needs nuclear weapons that it's willing to rebuild them while its own people struggle with inflation and power outages and economic collapse. But let's step back to the geopolitics, because that's where the real danger starts to emerge. And this satellite intelligence didn't appear in a vacuum. It became public during a very specific window. Washington temporarily eased restrictions that had blocked commercial satellite companies from freely distributing imagery of the region. For weeks, that data had been kept dark. But the moment it became available, the picture was damning enough that even cautious institutions felt forced to speak publicly. That's significant because it suggests someone inside the American security apparatus made a deliberate choice. They let this information breathe publicly before the blackout returned. That's not an accident. That's a signal. It's Washington telling Tehran that we're watching every concrete truck, every reinforced tunnel entrance, every covered crater. Whether or not the satellite images are publicly available, we know what you're doing. And at almost the exact same moment these images surfaced, the ceasefire started falling apart. Iranian vessels and proxy forces escalated activity in the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical shipping lanes on the planet. Through this strait moves roughly a fifth of the world's oil and natural gas every single day.
Global trade depends on this waterway remaining open, and Iran knows this perfectly.
The American president publicly declared the ceasefire was finished following the exchange of strikes. Iranian state media moved just as fast to deny that any negotiations were happening at all. Both sides started performing strength, while privately, according to regional reports, still searching for off-ramps. Talks reportedly floating in Switzerland in the days ahead. But the public position was clear. The ceasefire was breaking, and with it, the entire calculus of the region shifted.
Let me expand the lens, because this story isn't just about two buildings in Iran.
This is about an entire region rearranging itself in real time, and every piece connects. For Israeli intelligence, the confirmation of activity at Talagan 2 is close to a nightmare scenario, because this is the site directly tied to Project Ahmad, the very program Israel has spent 2 decades warning the world about. If Iran is willing to risk breaching an international agreement just weeks after signing it to rebuild this specific location, it tells Israeli planners something critical. Iran's nuclear ambitions were never actually paused. They were only interrupted. And interrupted programs, in the eyes of Israeli military strategists, tend to come back more determined, more hidden, and more dangerous than before. Expect Israeli reconnaissance flights to intensify sharply in the coming weeks. Expect intelligence operations across Iranian airspace to increase. Ceasefire or not, Israel will not accept a scenario where Iran quietly rebuilds its weapons program while the world looks away. And that intensified Israeli activity increases the risk of another escalation cycle. Another round of strikes. Another moment where the entire region teeters on the edge of war. Here's where you should click subscribe, because the analysis you get from mainstream media rarely goes this deep. And when stories this important break, you'll see it here first with the context you actually need to understand what's happening. Washington, meanwhile, finds itself in an almost impossible position. The Memorandum of Understanding was supposed to prove that diplomacy could still work, that even in a region that's forgotten how to trust, conversation and agreement were possible.
That was the entire point. That was what the world needed to see.
And now the same government that signed it is quietly undermining it, forcing America to decide how to respond without triggering the very war the ceasefire was designed to prevent. Every option on the table carries enormous risk. Reimposing intelligence restrictions? That just allows Iran to hide more effectively. Restarting maximum sanctions? that destroys any remaining diplomatic channel and signals to Iran that negotiation is pointless.
Authorizing a second wave of strikes that ends the ceasefire entirely and commits America to a new military campaign in a region it's already stretched across multiple fronts.
And America is stretched thin. In the Pacific, China is conducting large-scale military exercises around Taiwan, testing American commitment and regional patience. In Eastern Europe, the war in Ukraine grinds on, consuming American weapons, attention, and political capital.
And now in the Middle East, a ceasefire that was supposed to hold is quietly falling apart.
Washington has to divide already stretched military resources across 3 separate global crisis points simultaneously. A superpower doesn't get weaker just because it's distracted, but it absolutely gets slower. Slower to detect small violations before they become large ones. Slower to project overwhelming force to any single flashpoint. Slower to make the unified, focused decisions that actually deter aggression in the first place.
Every day America is negotiating in Switzerland over Iran is a day less attention on Taiwan.
Every carrier group repositioned toward the Gulf is one fewer available for the Pacific. Regimes in Tehran, Moscow, and Beijing understand this math perfectly. Then there's the Strait of Hormuz, that 33-kilometer-wide choke point where Iran holds genuine leverage over the entire global economy. An enormous share of the planet's daily oil and liquefied natural gas shipments squeeze through that gap every single day. Every time Iran signals aggression near those waters, insurance premiums for shipping companies spike within hours. Energy traders in London and Singapore start pricing in risk before a single shot is even fired. This is why Iran keeps returning to Hormuz as its preferred pressure valve. It doesn't require a missile launch to hurt the global economy. It only requires the credible threat of one. And a regime simultaneously exposed for rebuilding nuclear infrastructure has every incentive to keep that pressure valve open. Economic anxiety abroad distracts from military embarrassment at home. Now consider the role of the International Atomic Energy Agency, sitting in an increasingly impossible position. Its inspectors have been denied access to Pickax Mountain entirely. Their access to Iran's other declared facilities has grown more restricted with every round of tension since February. When the world's official nuclear watchdog is reduced to analyzing the same photographs as journalists and independent researchers, it's a clear sign of how far Iran has managed to push transparency into retreat.
Expect the agency's Director General to face intense pressure from Washington, Israel, and European capitals to issue a formal public finding of noncompliance.
That's a diplomatic step that historically has preceded some of the most severe sanctions snapbacks in the agency's history. Once that finding is issued, the diplomatic space for negotiation shrinks dramatically. The penalties become automatic. The spiral accelerates. This is where the real danger of the Iran situation comes into focus, because a distracted superpower isn't necessarily weaker, but it absolutely is slower. And slowness in geopolitics can be fatal. It creates windows for smaller powers to act before the great power can respond. It allows situations to escalate beyond the point where peaceful resolution is still possible. It turns policy miscalculations into wars. So why does Iran take this risk at all? Why rebuild a facility this sensitive just weeks after signing an agreement not to? The answer lies in Iran's own survival calculus. After the February bombing campaign, Iran's nuclear program suffered more than just physical damage. It suffered a credibility collapse. Decades of investment, billions of dollars, immense political capital, all set back in a matter of weeks by American and Israeli air power. For a regime whose legitimacy at home is increasingly tied to projecting strength and defiance against the West, a nuclear program left permanently crippled isn't just a strategic setback. It's an existential one. Rebuilding even quietly, even at the risk of breaching an international agreement, may feel to Tehran's leadership less like a gamble and more like survival.
Because the alternative, appearing permanently defeated on the world stage, is the outcome this regime fears most of all.
But here's the miscalculation sitting at the center of this entire strategy. Secrecy only works until it doesn't. And in an era of commercial satellite constellations circling the planet every 90 minutes, capturing high-resolution imagery of nearly every square meter of Earth's surface, true secrecy is becoming almost impossible to maintain.
Independent institutions like the Institute for Science and International Security didn't need access inside Iran's borders to catch this activity.
They just needed a camera in orbit and a pattern of concrete trucks that didn't add up. That's the trap Iran walked directly into. The more it tries to hide, the more precisely the world can now see. And this changes the entire negotiating position heading into any future talks. Before these images surfaced, Iran could plausibly claim it was simply too weakened and too damaged to be actively rebuilding anything. That narrative is now effectively dead. Any diplomat sitting across the table from Iranian negotiators in the coming weeks will be doing so with satellite photography in hand. Proof that the other side already tested the boundaries of the agreement within a month of signing it. Consider what this means for Iran's remaining options. Continuing to rebuild quietly risks a second wave of strikes potentially far more devastating than the first. But halting construction visibly would force Iran to admit to its own population that months of labor and resources were essentially wasted while gaining nothing in return. Neither option restores the deterrent Iran lost in February. Neither option erases the credibility damage already done. The regime isn't choosing between victory and defeat anymore. It's choosing which version of setback it can survive politically at home. The machinery of enforcement is already turning. Renewed calls are expected in Washington for immediate reimposition of sanctions, specifically targeting the construction and engineering firms linked to work at Parchin and the Zagros complex. Satellite photographs of concrete trucks at a nuclear weapons research site have a way of collapsing diplomatic patience very quickly. And European governments, who have spent years walking a careful line between engagement and pressure on Iran, are now facing growing domestic pressure to abandon that balancing act altogether.
Iran isn't the first regime to try quietly rebuilding a weapons program after a devastating strike while the world's attention drifted elsewhere.
North Korea did something remarkably similar, following international pressure campaigns meant to freeze its own nuclear ambitions. Syria attempted something similar with a covert reactor project in the Deir ez-Zor desert. History has shown again and again that regimes under this kind of pressure rarely abandon their programs outright. They pause, they wait for attention to drift, and they resume the moment the cameras seem to look away.
But the difference this time is that the cameras never actually left. They just moved into orbit.
They circle the planet continuously. They capture everything. They forget nothing. And a regime that's betting on invisibility in the age of satellites is betting on something that no longer exists. There's also the economic reality that rarely makes it into the headlines. Every dollar funneled into concrete trucks and reinforced tunnel entrances at Pickax Mountain is a dollar not spent on hospitals, on food subsidies, on the crumbling power grid. The grid that leaves millions of ordinary Iranians without reliable electricity during peak summer heat. The regime frames this as a matter of national sovereignty and dignity. But for families living paycheck to paycheck in Tehran and Isfahan, it looks a great deal more like a government choosing pride over their own survival yet again. Iran's leadership may believe that patience, secrecy, and 60 days of diplomatic cover were enough to rebuild what was lost in February. But in a world watched constantly from orbit, there's no such thing as quiet reconstruction anymore. Every hole that gets covered gets photographed first. Every truck that arrives gets counted. Every regime that gambles on secrecy in the age of satellites eventually discovers the same uncomfortable truth. The lid never stays fully closed. And that's where we are right now. Standing at a moment where satellite technology has fundamentally changed the rules of how states can hide weapons programs from the world, where a regime's best-kept secrets can be exposed by commercial imagery that any news organization can purchase, where the old game of hide-and-seek between great powers is being played by new rules that nobody fully understands yet. The ceasefire isn't just crumbling over the next few weeks. It's already broken. The only question now is how fast it accelerates into something worse, and whether any of the sides involved still has the room to step back before that happens.
Thanks for sticking with this analysis all the way through. If you found this helpful, please like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts.
And share this with someone who actually cares about understanding what's really happening in the world instead of just accepting the surface level headlines.